Imagine this: Nuremberg, 1945. An American psychiatrist sits across from Hermann Goering, Hitler's second-in-command, commander of the Luftwaffe, and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. The psychiatrist expects to find madness, defeat, guilt, a mind broken by the crimes of the regime. Instead, Göring scores 138 on an intelligence test. He understands complex questions. He remembers everything. And the psychiatrists find no clear sign that he is disconnected from reality. He is not confused about what he has done. He simply does not believe it was wrong. Hermann Goering wasn't insane, that was the problem. Today we open the archive on the psychology of Hermann Goering. This is the Iron Archive. This was Hermann Goering, Hitler's second-in-command, commander of the Luftwaffe, founder of the Gestapo, a central figure in the Nazi state. He had held enormous power. He had helped direct the machinery of war. He had signed an order giving Reinhard Heydrich authority to prepare the so-called final solution to the Jewish question. And by the time he arrived at Nuremberg, Göring was carrying more than political power. He was carrying a serious drug dependency, a vast collection of stolen artwork, and an absolute certainty that he was the most important person in any room he entered. But in October 1945, the Allies faced a question that military evidence could not answer. Could a man connected to mass murder understand exactly what he had done and still feel no genuine remorse? To answer that question, the Allies placed Göring under psychiatric observation, and this is where the story becomes genuinely disturbing. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945. 24 senior Nazi officials faced charges including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. But the Allies wanted more than convictions. They wanted an explanation. How had an entire political system turned mass murder into administration? What kind of people could build that system, defend it, and continue to function inside it? 2 Americans were given unusual access to the defendants. Major Douglas Kelly was a military psychiatrist. Captain Gustav Gilbert was a psychologist who spoke fluent German. They interviewed the prisoners repeatedly, in their cells, in offices, and in private conversations that could last for hours. They administered intelligence tests, personality assessments, and Rorschach tests. This was not a single interview. It was months of observation. A courtroom performance could be rehearsed. Private conversations were more revealing. And among all the defendants, Göring was one of the most compelling subjects. Because the first major discovery was not that Göring was irrational. It was that he was exceptionally intelligent. Kelly wanted to establish a basic intellectual profile of the defendants. The results challenged a convenient assumption. Many were educated, strategic, and capable of understanding complex arguments. Göring scored 138 on the intelligence test administered at Nuremberg. That placed him among the highest-scoring defendants. But the number itself was not the most important finding. Göring could follow several arguments at once. He remembered administrative details. He understood the legal and political implications of the questions put to him. He was not struggling to understand the world around him. He understood it very well, and that distinction matters. Intelligence does not create morality, it creates capacity. A highly intelligent person can use that capacity to build institutions, solve problems, and protect other people, or to organize violence more efficiently. The tests did not provide the convenient explanation that Göring had been detached from reality and unable to understand his actions. He could understand the arguments. He remembers administrative details. He understood the legal and political implications of the questions put to him. He was not struggling to understand the world around him. He understood it very well. The disturbing question was no longer, did he know? It was, what did knowing mean to him? Kelly and Gilbert described a personality built around status, grandiosity, and self-protection. Göring believed he was exceptional. He believed history would eventually vindicate him, and he treated the courtroom as another arena in which he could control the narrative. He did not see himself as a criminal standing outside history. He saw himself as a statesman being judged by political enemies. This became the central defense. If the war was legitimate, then the violence was legitimate. If he had served the state, then responsibility belonged to the state. If the judges were the victors, then the trial itself could be dismissed as victor's justice. The moral distinction between combat and systematic murder became something he could argue around, not because he lacked the intelligence to understand the difference, but because accepting that difference would have forced him to accept responsibility. Göring had also spent years dependent on paracodeine after being wounded during the beer hall putsch. Before the trial, he was detoxified. The change was significant. He became clearer, more focused, more controlled. Detoxification had not created a new man. It had removed one of the things obscuring the old one. The result was not a broken addict. It was a sharper version of the same personality, more articulate, more composed, and even more effective as a performer. If you want more deep dives into the hidden systems behind Europe's darkest years, subscribe to Iron Archives. The archive is only beginning. When Göring took the witness stand in March 1946, the prosecution believed the evidence was overwhelming. There were documents, orders, meeting records, testimony from witnesses and survivors. But Göring understood that a courtroom was not only a place for evidence, it was a place for framing. He challenged the prosecutors. He corrected translations. He attacked the legal language of the trial. His aim was not always to prove that nothing had happened. His aim was to change what the events meant. A military order became a normal act of war. Political responsibility became obedience to the state. Mass violence became an argument about legal precedent. Other defendants benefited from his confidence. Göring gave them a narrative they could hide behind. He made the courtroom feel less like a place of judgment and more like a political debate. But documents do not become innocent because the person reading them is persuasive. The evidence eventually closed the space for performance. Göring was convicted on all 4 counts and sentenced to death. He did not accept the sentence as a moral judgment. He treated it as the final decision of an enemy system. Even at the end, he wanted control over the meaning of his own story. But the most disturbing conclusion was not what Göring did in the courtroom. It was what the psychiatric evidence suggested about people capable of doing such things. The easy explanation would have been that the Nazi leadership was made up of clinical monsters, men so abnormal that ordinary psychology could not explain them. That explanation would have been comforting. It would have placed evil safely outside normal human experience. But Nuremberg offered a more troubling picture. These were intelligent, organized, and functional individuals. They could plan. They could negotiate. They could maintain relationships. They could understand consequences, and they could still participate in mass murder. The problem was not always a mind disconnected from reality. Sometimes it was a mind that had learned to exclude certain people from moral consideration. Once victims became categories, populations, and administrative problems, violence could be carried out without feeling like violence. That is why the psychological record matters. It does not tell us that every intelligent person is dangerous. It tells us that intelligence is not protection against cruelty. Education is not protection against cruelty. Even self-awareness is not protection against cruelty. A person can understand the facts and still refuse the moral meaning of those facts. Göring did not need to believe that his victims were human in the same way he believed he was human. And once that gap existed, almost any action could be explained away. The most disturbing part was not that evil was impossible to understand. It was that it could exist inside a mind that understood almost everything, except the humanity of its victims. Göring's story ended before the sentence could be carried out. On the night before his scheduled execution, he took cyanide and died in his cell. The source of the capsule was never conclusively established. Even in death, he had chosen the final act himself. But his suicide did not change the verdict. It did not erase the orders, the documents, or the human cost of the system he helped build, and it did not prove that he had finally understood the moral weight of his actions. He had spent his life controlling the narrative. At Nuremberg, he tried to do the same thing one last time. In 1958, Douglas Kelly also died by suicide using cyanide. The parallel is documented. What it meant to Kelly personally is less certain. We should not invent a connection where the historical record cannot prove one. But the coincidence remains deeply unsettling. The man who studied Göring's mind eventually died using the same poison. Hermann Goering was not a misunderstood genius. He was not simply a madman. He was an intelligent, capable man who helped build a criminal system, and then refused to accept the meaning of his own choices. That is what made the psychiatric findings so disturbing. Not that evil was impossible to understand, but that it could exist inside a mind that understood almost everything, except the humanity of its victims. Hermann Goering wasn't insane, that was the problem. Subscribe for more deep dives into history, psychology, and the hidden systems behind World War II. Archive session closed.